You know what they say about Mother's Day? That it's a time for gratitude and family bonds. That daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law put aside their differences to celebrate the women who shaped their families. They say it's about respect, about honoring the sacrifices mothers make. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What they don't tell you is that sometimes Mother's Day becomes the day you discover just how expendable your own family thinks you are. And I'm sitting here today, 68 years old, to tell you exactly how wrong those pretty sentiments can be. The morning of Mother's Day started like any other Sunday in Phoenix, with the desert sun already promising another scorching day ahead. I was in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals for my family over the decades, grinding coffee beans and trying not to think about how quiet the house had become since Robert passed 2 years ago. The silence had weight to it now, pressing down on me like the Arizona heat, broken only by the occasional hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of my neighbor's sprinkler systems fighting the inevitable drought. I should have known something was off when Jessica suggested we celebrate Mother's Day at their house instead of going out to brunch like we had for the past 5 years. "It'll be more intimate, Mom," my son Daniel had said when he called the night before. "Jess wants to cook for you, make it really special." The way he said it, with that careful tone he developed since marrying Jessica 3 years ago, should have been my first warning. It was the voice of a man walking on eggshells, choosing his words to avoid conflict at home. But I was lonely enough to hope and foolish enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, my daughter-in-law had finally decided to make an effort. 3 years of stilted conversations, forced smiles, and the distinct feeling that I was somehow always in the way had worn me down. I told myself that Jessica was just adjusting, that blending families took time, that eventually she'd understand I wasn't trying to compete with her for Daniel's attention. How naive I was. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue dress that Robert had always said brought out my eyes, and spent extra time on my makeup. 68 years old, and I was still trying to win approval from a woman young enough to be my daughter. The irony wasn't lost on me, even then. I drove across town to their suburban neighborhood, past the cookie-cutter houses with their perfectly manicured lawns and 3-car garages, each one a testament to the American dream that Daniel and Jessica were living. Their house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, a sprawling ranch-style home with a red tile roof and a front yard full of desert landscaping that required minimal water but maximum maintenance fees. Jessica had insisted on the house when they were shopping, dismissing Daniel's practical concerns about the mortgage payment with a wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "We need space to grow," she'd said, and at the time I'd assumed she meant for children. Now I wondered if she'd meant space to keep unwanted family members at a distance. I rang the doorbell and waited, holding a small gift bag containing a silk scarf I'd picked out for Jessica, and a card expressing gratitude for welcoming me into their family. The words felt hollow, even as I'd written them, but I'd been raised to believe that kindness could bridge any gap, that persistence and grace would eventually win over even the most resistant hearts. Daniel answered the door, and my heart did that automatic flutter it had done since the day he was born 32 years ago. He was still my little boy in so many ways, despite the receding hairline and the stress lines around his eyes that had appeared since his marriage. He worked in finance for a commercial real estate firm, a job that required long hours and generated significant stress, but it provided the lifestyle Jessica demanded. "Happy Mother's Day, Mom," he said, giving me a hug that felt obligatory rather than enthusiastic. Over his shoulder, I could see Jessica in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail, wearing a designer apron over what looked like a very expensive sundress. She didn't look up when I entered, focusing instead on whatever she was preparing on the stove. "Jess is making her famous French toast," Daniel said, though I'd never heard of Jessica being famous for anything culinary. She'd grown up with a housekeeper who did most of the cooking, and since marrying Daniel, they'd relied heavily on takeout and meal delivery services. "And she's made mimosas." The dining room table was set for 3, with Jessica's wedding china and crystal champagne flutes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Fresh flowers sat in a vase in the center, artfully arranged in a way that suggested they'd been done by a professional rather than picked from a garden. Everything looked picture perfect, like a spread from a home decorating magazine. But there was something sterile about it, something that felt more like a stage set than a family gathering. "This is lovely," I said, setting my purse down and holding out the gift bag to Jessica. "I brought you a little something." Jessica looked up from the stove for the first time since I'd arrived, and I caught something in her expression that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't quite hostility, but it wasn't warmth either. It was the look someone gives an uninvited guest who's overstayed their welcome. "Oh, you didn't need to do that," she said, wiping her hands on her apron before taking the bag. Her tone was polite but distant, the kind of courtesy you'd show a stranger. "I'll open it later." Later. Not now, not with Daniel watching, not in the spirit of the moment. Later, when she could dispose of whatever I'd brought without having to feign gratitude in front of my son. We sat down to eat, and I tried to fill the silence with questions about their lives, their work, their plans for the summer. Jessica answered in monosyllables while Daniel seemed to be working overtime to keep the conversation going. The French toast was good, though I suspected it had come from a mix rather than being made from scratch. And the mimosas were strong enough to suggest Jessica had been drinking before I arrived. "How's the house treating you?" I asked, looking around at the open floor plan that flowed from dining room to living room to kitchen. "Are you settling in well?" "It's perfect," Jessica said, her first complete sentence of the meal. "Finally, we have the space we need." There was something pointed about the way she said it, an emphasis on the word "we," that seemed to exclude me from whatever space they were discussing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I saw him give Jessica a look that might have been warning or pleading. "Mom's been great about giving us our space," Daniel said quickly, "very respectful of our privacy." Privacy, another loaded word. I thought about all the times I'd called and been told they were busy, all the invitations that had been politely declined, all the grandchildren's events I had learned about after the fact, because Jessica had forgotten to mention them. I was beginning to understand that my respectful distance had been interpreted as something else entirely. "Speaking of space," Jessica said, setting down her champagne flute with a small clink against the table, "we actually wanted to talk to you about something today." The way she said it made my blood run cold. There was a finality to her tone, a sense that whatever was coming had been planned and rehearsed. Daniel looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in cutting his French toast into precise squares. "Oh," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "What's on your minds?" Jessica exchanged a look with Daniel, one of those married couple communications that happens without words. When he didn't speak up, she took a deep breath and folded her hands in her lap, like she was about to deliver a prepared speech. "We've been thinking about our future," she began, "about what we want our lives to look like as we build our family. And we've realized that we need to be more intentional about our boundaries." Quote, "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Boundaries. The word hit me like a slap. In my generation, families didn't have boundaries. They had obligations and loyalties, and unspoken agreements about supporting each other through life's challenges. Boundaries were what you had with neighbors or coworkers, not with the people who shared your blood. "What kind of boundaries?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. "Well," Jessica continued, glancing at Daniel again, "we think it would be healthier for everyone if we had some space to establish our own traditions. As a nuclear family." Nuclear family. Another exclusionary term, designed to separate the essential from the expendable. I was no longer part of the nuclear family, apparently. I was something else, something peripheral, something that could be managed and contained and kept at arm's length. "I see," I said, though I didn't see it all. "And what would that look like, practically speaking?" Daniel finally spoke up, his voice strained. "Maybe fewer phone calls during the week. And perhaps alternating holidays so we can start our own traditions." Fewer phone calls. I currently called once a week, usually on Sunday evenings, conversations that lasted maybe 15 minutes and covered the basic details of our lives. If that was too much, what would be acceptable? Once a month? Once a quarter? Special occasions only? And the holidays? I asked. We'll do Christmas this year, Jessica said brightly, as if she was offering me a generous gift. But Thanksgiving and Easter will be just us. And next year we'll switch. Just us. There it was again, that invisible line being drawn around Daniel and Jessica, creating a circle that didn't include the woman who had raised Daniel, who had sacrificed her own dreams to put him through college, who had been there for every milestone and achievement and heartbreak of his life, until Jessica came along. I understand you want to create your own traditions, I said carefully, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. But these holidays have been important to our family for decades. Your father and I— Your father is dead, Jessica interrupted, and the bluntness of it hit me like a physical blow. And Daniel isn't a child anymore. He's a grown man with his own family now. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at his plate, his jaw working like he was chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to say. Jessica sat back in her chair with a satisfied expression, like she'd just won a debate rather than shattered what was left of a family. Jessica, Daniel said quietly, that was honest, she said, cutting him off. Look, Margaret, I know this is hard to hear, but you need to understand that Daniel and I are building something here. We're planning for children, for a life together, and we can't do that if we're constantly managing your expectations and your needs. Managing my expectations. As if hoping to remain part of my son's life was some unreasonable demand. Some burden that they were graciously shouldering out of obligation rather than love. My needs are very simple, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. I want to be part of my son's life. I want to be a grandmother to your children when they come. I want to maintain the family connections that have sustained us through good times and bad. But that's just it, Jessica said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone making a closing argument. Your needs are a burden we can't carry anymore. Every phone call, every holiday, every family gathering becomes about managing your feelings and making sure you're included and comfortable. We can't build our own life when we're constantly worried about disrupting yours. A burden. She had actually said it. The word hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, poisoning everything it touched. I was a burden to the son I had raised, to the family I had helped create, to the young woman who had benefited from every sacrifice I'd made to ensure Daniel could provide for her. I looked at my son, waiting for him to speak up, to defend me, to tell his wife that she had gone too far. But Daniel just sat there, staring at his hands, the silence stretching until it became its own form of communication. His refusal to speak was an answer in itself. A burden, I repeated, tasting the word like poison. Is that what you both think of me? It's not personal, Jessica said, though everything about this felt intensely personal. It's just reality. You're at a stage of life where you need things from us. Attention, inclusion, emotional support. And we're at a stage where we need to focus on building rather than maintaining. Building rather than maintaining. As if love were a construction project, rather than a living thing that required nurturing and care. As if family were a business venture, rather than a collection of people bound together by shared history and mutual support. I see, I said, standing up from the table. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice remained calm. Thank you for making your position so clear. Margaret, Daniel said, finally looking up, please don't. Don't what? I asked. Don't acknowledge what your wife just told me? Don't accept that I'm no longer welcome in the family I helped create? That's not what she said, Daniel protested, but his words lacked conviction. That's exactly what she said, I replied. I'm a burden you can't carry anymore. I think that's pretty unambiguous. I picked up my purse and walked toward the front door, my movements mechanical and deliberate. Behind me, I could hear Daniel's chair scraping against the floor as he stood up, but he didn't follow me. Jessica didn't even bother to get up. Mom, Daniel called out as I reached the door. We can work this out. We just need some time to figure things out. I turned back to look at him, this man I had raised, and saw a stranger wearing my son's face. When had he become someone who could sit silently while his wife called his mother a burden? When had he learned to prioritize his own comfort over basic human decency? Take all the time you need, I said. Clearly, I'm not going anywhere. I drove home in a haze of shock and rage, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. The Phoenix streets blurred past me, a landscape of strip malls and housing developments that all looked the same, reflecting the emptiness I felt inside. I had gone to their house hoping for connection, and left with the devastating knowledge that I was seen as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. When I got home, I sat in my car in the driveway for a long time, staring at the house Robert and I had bought 40 years ago when Daniel was just a baby. We'd chosen it for the good schools and the family-friendly neighborhood, sacrificing our own wants for what we thought our son would need. The mortgage had been a stretch on Robert's teacher's salary, especially with me staying home to raise Daniel, but we'd believed it was an investment in our family's future. Now that future felt like a cruel joke. The son we'd raised in this house, the boy who'd played in this yard and done his homework at the kitchen table and brought his friends here after school, had grown up to see his mother as a burden to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I finally went inside and sat down at the kitchen table, still wearing my Mother's Day dress, and tried to process what had just happened. The house felt different somehow, emptier and smaller than it had when I'd left that morning. The photographs of Daniel that lined the hallway seemed to mock me now, reminders of a son who had existed only in my imagination. The phone rang around 6 o'clock. Daniel's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd come to his senses. Maybe he'd realized how hurtful Jessica's words had been. Maybe he was calling to apologize and smooth things over. I answered on the fourth ring. "Mom." His voice was strained. "Careful. I wanted to call and make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," I said, though nothing about this felt fine. "Look, about what Jessica said, she didn't mean it the way it sounded. She's just stressed about work, and we've been talking about starting a family, and she's worried about having enough time and energy for everything." Excuses. He was making excuses for behavior that had no excuse, trying to soften words that had been deliberately chosen to hurt. Jessica hadn't misspoken or lost her temper. She had calmly and systematically explained why I was no longer welcome in their lives. "What she said was very clear," I replied. "I don't think there was any misunderstanding. She just needs time to adjust. This whole family thing is new for her, and she's trying to figure out how to balance everything." "Daniel," I said quietly, "do you think I'm a burden?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. If the answer had been no, he would have said so immediately, emphatically, without hesitation. Instead, he was choosing his words carefully, trying to find a way to agree with his wife without completely destroying his relationship with his mother. "I think," he said finally, "that we all need to find a better balance." Balance. Another euphemism for exclusion. Another way of saying that my presence in his life needed to be minimized for his comfort and convenience. "I understand," I said. "Thank you for clarifying your position." "Mom, please don't." I hung up before he could finish whatever he was going to say. There was nothing left to discuss, no middle ground to be found, no compromise that would restore the relationship we'd once had. Jessica had drawn her line in the sand, and Daniel had chosen his side. I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, surrounded by 40 years of memories and the crushing realization that none of them seemed to matter to the people I'd made them with. The Mother's Day that was supposed to celebrate my role in the family had instead revealed how expendable that role had become. But something else was beginning to stir inside me, something harder and colder than grief. Jessica had called me a burden, dismissed me as someone whose needs were too much trouble to accommodate. She had assumed I was weak, dependent, someone who could be managed and controlled and eventually discarded. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I drove downtown to the office of Patricia Hernandez, the estate planning attorney who had helped Robert and me set up our wills and trusts 15 years earlier. Patricia was a sharp woman in her 50s, who had built her practice on serving middle-class families who wanted to ensure their assets were protected and their wishes honored after death. "Margaret," she said, rising from behind her desk to greet me. "I wasn't expecting to see you. How can I help you today?" "I need to review my life insurance policies," I said, settling into the leather chair across from her desk. "All of them. Patricia pulled out a thick file folder and spread the documents across her desk. Robert and I had been thorough in our planning, perhaps overly so. We'd wanted to ensure that Daniel would be financially secure, no matter what happened to us, that our deaths wouldn't create hardship for the son we loved so much. "Let's see," Patricia said, adjusting her reading glasses. "You have the group policy from Robert's school district, which paid out when he passed. That was $500,000. Then there's your individual policy with Prudential, another $500,000, with Daniel as the primary beneficiary. And the small whole life policy you took out when Daniel was born, that's only $25,000, but it has accumulated quite a bit of cash value over the years." "What about the policy through my employer?" I asked. I'd worked part-time as a substitute teacher for the past 10 years, mainly to stay busy and supplement our retirement income. "Right, the group term life through the school district, that's $250,000, also with Daniel as beneficiary." I did the quick math in my head. $775,000, plus whatever the cash value had accumulated to on the whole life policy. Nearly $800,000 that would go to Daniel when I died, money that would ultimately benefit Jessica and whatever children they might have. "And the house?" I asked. "Also goes to Daniel, according to your will. The property is worth, what, about $400,000 in today's market? Over $1 million in total. More than enough for Daniel and Jessica to pay off their mortgage, fund their children's college educations, and live comfortably for years to come. All of it contingent on my death, all of it representing a lifetime of careful planning and sacrifice to benefit the son who now saw me as a burden." "I'd like to make some changes," I said. Patricia raised an eyebrow. "What kind of changes?" "I want to review the beneficiaries on all the policies. And I want to discuss setting up a charitable trust." "A charitable trust?" Patricia leaned back in her chair. "That's a significant change, Margaret. Can I ask what's prompting this?" I thought about how to answer that question. "How do you explain that your son's wife called you a burden on Mother's Day? How do you convey the devastating realization that the people you love most see you as nothing more than an obstacle to their happiness? Let's just say I've had some recent insights into how my death would be received by my current beneficiaries," I said. "And I want to ensure my assets go to people who will appreciate them." Patricia nodded slowly. As an estate planning attorney, she'd probably seen every variation of family dysfunction imaginable. "I should warn you that making dramatic changes to your estate plan in response to family conflicts can sometimes be challenged in court." "Only if the changes aren't properly documented and justified," I replied. "And only if someone has standing to challenge them. Daniel would have standing as your current beneficiary, not if he's no longer a beneficiary." The words hung in the air between us, their implications settling like sediment. Patricia had known Robert and me for 15 years. She'd watched us plan and prepare and sacrifice for Daniel's future. The idea that I would cut him out entirely was clearly shocking to her. "Margaret," she said gently, "I have to ask, are you sure you want to do this? Estate planning decisions made in the heat of emotional conflict sometimes get regretted later." "I'm not acting in the heat of emotion," I said, though that wasn't entirely true. "I'm acting on information I've recently received about how my family views me and my role in their lives. If I'm truly the burden they believe me to be, then they should be relieved to know they won't have to manage that burden much longer. But they'd still inherit. They'd inherit the responsibility of managing my assets after my death, which Jessica has made clear is exactly the kind of burden she wants to avoid. I'm simply respecting her wishes." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across her desk. "There are other options," she said finally. "You could establish conditions for inheritance, requirements that would need to be met before Daniel could access the funds. Educational requirements, family obligations, behavioral standards. Such as? Well, you could require that he maintain regular contact with you while you're alive, or that he provide financial support if you need long-term care, or that any inheritance be held in trust for his children rather than going directly to him and his wife." The idea was intriguing, but it felt like trying to buy love with legal contracts. If Daniel and Jessica didn't want me in their lives, Forcing them to pretend otherwise in exchange for inheritance money would only create more resentment and manipulation. No, I said. If they don't want the responsibility of maintaining a relationship with me, they shouldn't get the benefits of inheriting from me. Then what are you thinking? I had been thinking about this all night, lying awake in the bed I'd shared with Robert for 35 years, staring at the ceiling and imagining different scenarios. The Phoenix Children's Hospital, I said. They have an excellent pediatric oncology unit. Patricia made a note. That's a worthy cause. And the Arizona Humane Society. Robert and I always meant to get another dog after Bentley died, but we never got around to it. Anything else? I thought about the teachers who had shaped my own life, the educators who had inspired me to believe that knowledge and learning could transform lives. The scholarship fund at Arizona State University, for first-generation college students. These are all excellent choices, Patricia said. But Margaret, I have to ask one more time. Are you absolutely certain about cutting Daniel out entirely? Maybe a smaller inheritance? Or splitting the assets between him and the charities? I considered her question seriously. Part of me still loved my son, still hoped that somehow this rift could be healed and our relationship restored. But a larger part of me understood that love without respect was worthless, that being included in someone's life out of obligation or financial incentive was worse than being excluded entirely. Let me ask you something, I said. If your daughter told you that your presence in her life was a burden she couldn't carry anymore, would you want her to inherit your life's work? Patricia winced. I see your point. Daniel has made his choice about what kind of relationship he wants with me. I am simply making my choice about what kind of legacy I want to leave. We spent the next 2 hours going through the paperwork, changing beneficiaries, establishing the charitable trusts, ensuring that every legal requirement was met and documented. Patricia was thorough, asking detailed questions about my mental state, my understanding of the decisions I was making, and my reasons for each change. I want to make sure this is bulletproof, she explained. If Daniel decides to challenge these changes, I want there to be no question about your competency or your motivations. Will he be notified of the changes? Not automatically. Beneficiary changes are typically private until the policyholder dies. But if you want him to know... Not yet, I said. Let me think about the timing. As I drove home from Patricia's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. For the first time since Robert's death, I was making decisions based on my own values and priorities, rather than trying to manage other people's expectations. Jessica had called me a burden, but she had no idea that this burden was worth nearly $1 million to the people who would ultimately receive it. The irony was delicious. While Jessica was calculating how to minimize my impact on their lives, I was calculating how to maximize my impact on causes that actually mattered to me. While she was drawing boundaries to keep me at a distance, I was creating a legacy that would outlast all of us. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and Robert's photograph, feeling his presence in a way I hadn't since his funeral. What do you think? I asked his image. Did I do the right thing? Of course, he didn't answer, but I could imagine what he would have said. Robert had always been protective of our family, sometimes to a fault. He would have been devastated by Jessica's words and Daniel's silence, probably more so than I was. He would have supported my decision to protect our assets from people who didn't value the sacrifices we'd made to accumulate them. The phone rang, interrupting my conversation with the dead. Daniel's name appeared on the caller ID again, and this time I decided to answer. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, my voice warm and normal, as if yesterday's conversation had never happened. "Mom," he sounded relieved. "I'm so glad you answered. I was worried after the way our call ended last night." "No need to worry," I said cheerfully. "I've been thinking about what you and Jessica said, and I want you to know that I respect your decision." "You do?" "Of course. You're adults, and you have every right to set boundaries for your family. I may not like it, but I understand it." The silence on the other end told me that my reasonable response was the last thing he'd expected. He'd probably been prepared for tears, guilt trips, or emotional manipulation. Instead, I was giving him exactly what he'd asked for: acceptance of his decision. "I'm glad you understand," he said cautiously. "I was afraid you might be hurt." "Oh, I was hurt," I said honestly. "But being hurt doesn't mean you were wrong. If maintaining a relationship with me feels like a burden, then it's better for everyone if we minimize that burden." "Mom." "It's fine, Daniel. Really. I'm a big girl, and I've been taking care of myself for a long time. I'll be just fine." "But we still want you in our lives," he said quickly. "Just, with better boundaries." "I understand completely. And I want you to know that I won't be calling anymore. Won't be expecting holiday invitations. Won't be making any demands on your time or energy. You can build your family exactly the way you want to, without any interference from me." "That's not. We didn't mean—" "I know exactly what you meant," I said gently. "And I'm giving you what you asked for. Complete freedom to live your lives without worrying about managing my needs or expectations." Another long silence. I could practically hear him trying to figure out whether he'd gotten what he wanted or something else entirely. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked finally. "I'm better than okay," I said, and for the first time in months, it was true. "I'm free." After I hung up, I poured myself another glass of wine and began planning the next phase of my life. If I was going to be excluded from Daniel's family, then I needed to build a life that didn't depend on their inclusion. I had friends I'd neglected, interests I'd set aside, dreams I'd deferred in service of being the perfect mother and grandmother. Jessica had done me a favor, though she'd never know it. By forcing me to confront the reality of my situation, she'd liberated me from the exhausting work of trying to maintain relationships with people who didn't value them. I was 68 years old, in good health, with financial security and decades of life ahead of me. I was no longer anyone's mother, at least not in any way that mattered. But for the first time in years, I was fully myself. And that self was just getting started. The next 3 weeks passed in a strange kind of peace. Daniel called once, a stilted conversation where he asked if I needed anything and seemed relieved when I assured him I was managing just fine. Jessica, predictably, didn't call at all. I found myself grateful for the silence, for the absence of obligation to perform happiness I didn't feel or pretend that relationships existed where they clearly didn't. I threw myself into activities I'd been putting off for years. I joined a book club at the local library, started taking watercolor classes at the community center, and began volunteering at the literacy program downtown. For the first time since Robert's death, I was building a life that belonged entirely to me, not shaped by other people's expectations or needs. It was during one of these volunteer sessions, helping a young mother practice reading job applications, when I met Elena Rodriguez. She was maybe 35, with tired eyes and calloused hands that spoke of manual labor, struggling to sound out words that most people took for granted. Her 8-year-old daughter Sophia sat nearby, doing homework, with the focused intensity of a child who understood that education was the only path out of poverty. "I never learned proper," Elena explained during our first session together, her accent thick with embarrassment. "Had to work since I was 12. But Sophia, she's smart. Smarter than me. I want her to have chances I didn't get." Watching Elena fight for her daughter's future while my own son dismissed me as a burden created a painful contrast that I couldn't ignore. Here was a woman who had nothing but was willing to sacrifice everything for her child's success, while my son, who had everything, couldn't be bothered to maintain a relationship with the woman who had provided it all. "My mama always say education is the one thing nobody can take from you," Elena continued, pointing at a particularly challenging word on the practice test. "Even if you lose everything else, you keep what you learn in your head." Her words echoed in my mind long after our session ended. Education was indeed something that couldn't be taken away, and it was something I'd always valued. Both Robert and I had been teachers, believers in the transformative power of knowledge. Setting up that scholarship fund at Arizona State had felt right in a way that leaving money to Daniel no longer did. I started spending more time at the literacy center, working with adults who were trying to earn their GEDs or learn English as a second language. These people understood the value of what they were receiving because they'd lived without it. They showed up every week, grateful for the opportunity, working harder than most college students I'd known. They reminded me what appreciation looked like, what it felt like to be valued rather than tolerated. 3 weeks after Mother's Day, I was leaving the community center after my watercolor class when I spotted a familiar car in the parking lot. Daniel's silver BMW sat under one of the shade trees, and through the windshield I could see him talking animatedly on his phone. My first instinct was to walk in the other direction, to avoid whatever confrontation this represented, but something made me approach instead. He saw me coming and quickly ended his call, getting out of the car with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't the guilty look of someone who'd been caught, but it wasn't entirely innocent either. "Mom," he said, giving me an awkward hug. "I was hoping to catch you here." "How did you know where to find me?" I asked. It wasn't as if I'd been keeping my activities secret, but I hadn't mentioned the community center to him either. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned it when I ran into her at the grocery store. She said you'd been taking art classes." Mrs. Patterson was my next-door neighbor, a sweet woman in her 70s who had a talent for friendly gossip. I made a mental note to be more careful about what information I shared, even casually. "The classes are wonderful," I said, genuinely meaning it. "I'm learning techniques I never knew existed." "That's great," Daniel said, but his heart wasn't in the conversation. He kept glancing around the parking lot like he was expecting someone else to appear. "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something." Here it comes, I thought. Another boundary, another restriction, another way to further minimize my role in his life. "What's on your mind?" I asked. "It's about the house," he said, and immediately my guard went up. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we're concerned about you living there alone. It's a big place, and with Dad gone, it might be too much for you to handle." "The house? Of course. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a large yard, and a swimming pool that Robert had installed when Daniel was in high school. It was worth at least $400,000 in the current market, money that would go a long way toward funding Daniel and Jessica's lifestyle. I'm managing just fine," I said carefully. "The maintenance isn't really an issue." "But it could become one," Daniel pressed. "And the expenses, the property taxes, the utilities, the insurance. Wouldn't it make more sense to downsize to something more manageable?" Manageable. Another euphemism, like boundaries and space and burden. What he really meant was profitable, at least for him. "I love that house," I said. "Your father and I raised you there. All my memories are there." "I know, and we respect that, but Jessica found this really nice senior community about 20 minutes from our place. Active lifestyle, lots of amenities, people your own age. You might actually enjoy it more than rattling around in that big house by yourself." A senior community. I could picture it perfectly. Beige walls, scheduled activities, communal dining rooms where residents competed over who had the most attentive children. The kind of place where I'd be encouraged to play bingo and complain about my ailments while slowly forgetting who I used to be. "And what would happen to the house?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Well, we'd have to sell it, obviously. But the proceeds would go toward your care, making sure you're comfortable and have everything you need." The proceeds would go toward my care. Not to me directly, but to my care, which meant Daniel and Jessica would control how the money was spent. They'd probably set up some kind of trust or guardianship arrangement, making sure I had enough for basic living expenses while they managed the bulk of the assets. "Have you already looked at these communities?" I asked. "Just preliminary research," Daniel said quickly. "We haven't made any commitments or anything. We just wanted to explore options." Options. Another loaded word. They were exploring options for managing the burden I represented, finding ways to warehouse me efficiently while gaining access to my assets. "I see," I said. "And what kind of timeline were you thinking about for this move?" "No rush," Daniel said, though his eagerness suggested otherwise. "Maybe sometime in the next few months, when you're ready." "When I'm ready." As if readiness were the only factor. As if my preferences mattered in their decision-making process. The illusion of choice while the outcome was predetermined. "I'll think about it," I said. Which was true. I would think about it, just not in the way Daniel expected. "Great," he said, relief evident in his voice. "And Mom, I want you to know this is coming from a place of love. We just want what's best for you." Love. The word felt hollow coming from him now, stripped of meaning by Jessica's casual cruelty and his own complicity. If this was love, then I was better off without it. I know you think you're doing what's best, I said. I'll be in touch once I've had time to consider everything. I drove home feeling like I'd just escaped a trap that was still being set. Daniel and Jessica weren't content with simply establishing boundaries around our relationship. They wanted to control my living situation, my finances, and ultimately my independence. The house wasn't just my home. It was my security, my connection to Robert, and my primary asset. Giving it up would leave me entirely dependent on their goodwill and management. That evening, I called Patricia Hernandez. "Margaret," she said, answering on the second ring, "how are you settling in with the changes we made?" "I'm comfortable with them," I said. "But I have a new concern. My son has started talking about me selling the house and moving to a senior community." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Is that something you're interested in?" "Not at all. But I'm worried about pressure tactics, about them trying to convince me I'm not capable of living independently." "That's a legitimate concern," Patricia said. "Adult children sometimes use safety and health concerns as leverage to gain control over their parents' assets. Do you have any cognitive issues, memory problems, anything that might give them legal grounds to challenge your competency?" "None whatsoever. I'm as sharp as I've ever been." "Good. But I'd recommend documenting that. Maybe get a cognitive assessment from your doctor, something that establishes your mental competency in writing. If your son and daughter-in-law are planning to challenge your decision-making capacity, you want to be prepared. What else can I do to protect myself? Make sure all your legal documents are current and properly executed. Consider setting up a durable power of attorney with someone you trust, but only if you become incapacitated. And perhaps most importantly, document any conversations or interactions that might be relevant later." Document conversations. I thought about my exchange with Daniel that afternoon, how carefully he'd chosen his words to sound caring while maneuvering for control. If I'd been recording that conversation, it would have revealed the manipulation behind his supposed concern. "Patricia," I said, "what would happen if I wanted to give away significant assets while I'm still alive, rather than waiting for them to be distributed after my death?" "You mean like making large charitable donations now?" "Exactly. There's no legal barrier to that, as long as you're competent and acting of your own free will, though there might be tax implications depending on the amounts involved. But it would prevent anyone from inheriting those assets later." "You can't inherit what no longer exists," Patricia confirmed. "If you donated your house to charity tomorrow, there would be no house for Daniel to inherit, regardless of what your will says." The idea was intriguing. Instead of waiting for my death to redirect my assets, I could start redistributing them immediately. It would eliminate any possibility of legal challenges and ensure that my wishes were carried out exactly as I intended. "Let me ask you this," I said. "If someone were trying to have me declared incompetent in order to gain control of my assets, what would the timeline look like for that process?" "It varies, but typically several months at minimum. They'd need to file petitions, provide medical evidence, have you evaluated by court-appointed professionals. It's not something that happens overnight. Several months. That would give me time to act if I needed to, time to ensure my assets were protected before anyone could interfere with my decisions." After hanging up with Patricia, I spent the evening researching senior communities online, not because I was interested in moving, but because I wanted to understand what Daniel and Jessica had in mind. The facilities they'd probably researched were nice enough, but they all had the same institutional feel, the same emphasis on safety and supervision over independence and dignity. More importantly, they were expensive. The initial buy-in fees ranged from $50,000 to over $100,000, with monthly costs that could easily consume most of a retiree's income. If Daniel could convince me to sell the house and move to one of these places, he'd have access to hundreds of thousands of dollars in proceeds that would otherwise be tied up in real estate. The financial incentive was clear, but I was beginning to suspect there was more to their plan than simple greed. Jessica's hostility hadn't emerged in a vacuum. It was part of a calculated strategy to isolate me, undermine my confidence, and create justification for taking control of my life. The Mother's Day confrontation hadn't been an emotional outburst. It had been the opening move in a larger campaign. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to my interactions with Daniel and Jessica, looking for patterns I'd previously missed. Daniel's visits had become more frequent but also more purposeful, each one involving some suggestion about my health, my safety, or my living situation. He'd started bringing up my age more often, making comments about my memory or my physical capabilities that were subtle but persistent. "Are you sure you should be driving at night, Mom?" he'd asked after I mentioned attending an evening lecture at the library. "I worry about your vision in the dark." "Maybe you should consider getting one of those life alert systems," he'd suggested another time. "Just in case something happens when you're alone." Each comment individually seemed caring and reasonable, but taken together they formed a narrative of decline and vulnerability that wasn't based in reality. I was 68, not 98. I was healthy, active, and mentally sharp. But Daniel was building a case for my incompetency, one concerned observation at a time. The realization that my own son was systematically undermining me was almost more devastating than Jessica's open hostility. At least Jessica's contempt was honest. Daniel's manipulation was dressed up as love and concern, making it both more insidious and more hurtful. I decided to test my suspicions. During Daniel's next visit, I deliberately mentioned some minor confusion about paying bills online, presenting it as a technology problem rather than a cognitive one. "Maybe it would be easier if you had someone help you with the finances," he suggested immediately. "I could take a look at your accounts, make sure everything's organized properly." Bingo. He'd gone straight for financial control, exactly as I'd expected. If he could establish himself as necessary for managing my money, it would be a short step to arguing that I needed more comprehensive assistance. "That's sweet of you to offer," I said, "but I think I can figure it out. I just need to spend more time learning the system." "But why struggle with it when I could just handle it for you? I deal with financial software all day at work." "I prefer to maintain my independence," I said firmly. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, a flash of frustration that he quickly covered with renewed concern. "Of course, Mom. I just want to make sure you're not overwhelmed." Overwhelmed. Another word designed to suggest that normal activities were becoming too much for me to handle. The gaslighting was subtle but persistent, and I could see how effective it would be over time. Someone less aware might begin to doubt their own capabilities, might start accepting help they didn't need until they'd surrendered control entirely. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. If Daniel and Jessica wanted to treat me like a burden they couldn't wait to be rid of, then I would give them exactly what they were asking for. They would discover that some burdens were far more valuable than they'd ever imagined, and some losses were permanent. I spent the next morning on the phone with various charitable organizations, discussing donation processes and tax implications. The Phoenix Children's Hospital was delighted to hear from me, especially when I mentioned the potential size of my gift. The development director, an energetic woman named Sarah Chen, offered to meet with me personally to discuss how my donation could be structured for maximum impact. "Mrs. Brennan," she said when we met at the hospital the following week, "your generosity could truly transform our pediatric oncology program. We've been trying to expand our research capabilities for years, but funding has been the limiting factor. Research is exactly what I want to support," I told her. "My husband and I never had grandchildren to worry about cancer, but that doesn't mean other children should suffer for lack of resources." It was a lie, of course. We'd expected grandchildren, had planned and hoped for them, had imagined ourselves as doting grandparents who would spoil Daniel's children with love and attention. But those grandchildren, if they ever materialized, would now have a mother who saw their grandmother as a burden, and a father who was too weak to defend family relationships. Better that my money go to children whose families would be grateful for the help. "We could establish a named research fund," Sarah suggested. "Something that would provide ongoing support for studies into new treatments and potentially cures. Your impact would be felt for generations." Generations. I liked the sound of that, the idea that my life's work would benefit children I'd never meet long after I was gone. It felt more meaningful than leaving money to people who saw my death as a financial opportunity rather than a personal loss. By the end of our meeting, I'd committed to donating $300,000 to the hospital, money that would come from selling some of the investments Robert and I had accumulated over the years. It wasn't everything, but it was a significant start, and it felt wonderful to see the genuine gratitude in Sarah's eyes when I signed the preliminary paperwork. The Arizona Humane Society was equally enthusiastic about my interest in supporting their programs. The director, a passionate woman named Linda Martinez, walked me through their facilities and explained how donations were used to care for abandoned and abused animals. We see so many cases where animals are discarded by families who just don't want the responsibility anymore, she told me as we watched volunteers working with rescue dogs. People get tired of caring for something that depends on them, so they just abandon it and move on with their lives. The parallel to my own situation was impossible to ignore. I was being abandoned by my family not because I was sick or difficult or demanding, but simply because caring for me had become inconvenient. The difference was that I had the power to choose where my resources went after the abandonment was complete. I'd like to establish a fund for senior animal care, I told Linda. Older dogs and cats that might be harder to place because they require more attention and medical care. That would be incredible, Linda said. Senior animals are often the first to be euthanized because people assume no one wants them. A dedicated fund for their care could save hundreds of lives. I committed another $100,000 to the Humane Society, money that would ensure senior animals received the care and attention that senior humans were apparently no longer entitled to expect from their families. The scholarship fund at Arizona State University was the most personally meaningful of my charitable commitments. I met with the financial aid director, a thoughtful man named James Wilson, who explained how scholarships for first-generation college students worked. These are kids whose parents never went to college, he told me. They're starting from scratch, without the family knowledge and support that most students take for granted. Your scholarship could be the difference between someone getting an education and someone spending their life in minimum-wage jobs. I thought about Elena Rodriguez, struggling to read job applications so her daughter could have better opportunities. I thought about all the students I'd taught over the years who had potential but lacked resources. I thought about the education Robert and I had valued so highly, the teaching careers we'd built, the belief we'd shared that knowledge could transform lives. I want to establish a fund that covers full tuition, room, and board for at least 5 students per year, I said. Kids who are smart and motivated but just need someone to believe in them. James calculated the numbers, factoring in tuition increases and endowment growth. A fund of that size would require an initial donation of approximately $400,000 to be sustainable in perpetuity. $400,000. Almost exactly what the house was worth, which was fitting since the house had originally been purchased to provide educational opportunities for Daniel. Now it would provide educational opportunities for students who would actually appreciate them. By the end of that week, I'd committed almost $800,000 to charitable causes, money that would be distributed over the next several months as I liquidated various assets. It represented nearly everything Daniel expected to inherit, redirected to people and organizations that would use it to make the world better, rather than simply to make their own lives more comfortable. The process of giving away my wealth was surprisingly liberating. Each donation felt like a small act of rebellion against the assumption that I was powerless, that my wishes could be ignored or overruled by people who claimed to know what was best for me. I was choosing how my life's work would be remembered, and that choice belonged entirely to me. Of course, Daniel and Jessica had no idea what I was doing. They continued their campaign to convince me that I needed more assistance, more supervision, more management of my daily life. Daniel's visits became even more frequent, always with some new suggestion about my health or safety. I've been thinking about what we discussed, he said during one particularly transparent attempt at manipulation. About the senior community. I think it would really be good for you to have people around, activities to keep you engaged. I'm quite engaged already, I said, thinking about my volunteer work, my art classes, my new friendships. I'm busier now than I've been in years. But it's not the same as having a structured environment with professional staff, Daniel insisted. What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? What if you had a medical emergency? What if? He was trying to make me afraid of possibilities that were no more likely at 68 than they'd been at 60. The goal wasn't to protect me. It was to convince me that protection was necessary so he could justify taking control. "Daniel," I said, deciding to test the waters, "are you worried about inheriting the house? Is that what this is really about?" His face flushed, a sure sign that I'd hit close to the target. "Of course not, Mom. This is about your safety and well-being. Because if you're concerned about the financial burden of maintaining the property after I'm gone, there are other solutions we could discuss." "What kind of solutions?" "Well, I could always sell it myself and donate the proceeds to charity. That way you wouldn't have to worry about it at all." The look of panic that crossed Daniel's face was almost comical. "You don't need to do anything drastic," he said quickly. "We just want to make sure you're safe and comfortable." Drastic. Donating my own money to charity was drastic. But maneuvering me into a senior community so they could access my assets was reasonable. The double standard was breathtaking in its audacity. "I'm perfectly safe and comfortable right now," I said. "But I appreciate your concern." After Daniel left that day, I called Patricia Hernandez to discuss the next phase of my plan. The charitable donations were proceeding smoothly, but I wanted to ensure that Daniel and Jessica couldn't interfere with my decisions once they realized what was happening. "The key is documentation," Patricia explained. "Every donation needs to be properly recorded, with clear evidence that you were acting competently and voluntarily. If someone tries to challenge your mental capacity later, we need to be able to show that you were making rational, well-considered decisions." "What about the house?" I asked. "If I decide to donate that as well?" "Real estate donations are more complex, but certainly possible. You'd need to have the property appraised, deal with tax implications, work with the receiving organization to handle the transfer. It's not something you'd want to rush into. But it's legally protected. No one could undo the donation if they didn't like it. Not if it's properly executed. Once you've legally transferred ownership to a charity, it's no longer your property to dispose of in a will. Your heirs would have no claim to it." That evening, I sat in my living room with a legal pad, making lists and calculations. In the space of a month, I'd gone from being a grieving widow desperate for family connection, to being a woman systematically dismantling the financial legacy that same family expected to inherit. The transformation felt both radical and inevitable, as if I'd finally stopped pretending to be someone I wasn't and started becoming who I was meant to be. The old Margaret had been defined by relationships, by her roles as wife and mother and grandmother in waiting. She'd measured her worth by how much she was needed, how successfully she could meet other people's expectations. That woman had been vulnerable to manipulation because she'd needed love more than she'd needed respect. The new Margaret was defined by her own values, her own choices, her own vision of how her life should matter. She was immune to manipulation because she no longer needed anything from the people who'd been using her need against her. She was free in a way that felt dangerous and intoxicating and absolutely right. The phone rang, interrupting my planning session. Jessica's name appeared on the caller ID, which was unusual enough to make me answer out of curiosity. "Margaret," she said, her voice artificially sweet. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all," I said. "What can I do for you?" "Well, Daniel mentioned that you're thinking about the senior community we discussed, and I wanted you to know how supportive I am of that decision." Supportive. How generous of her to support a decision I hadn't made. "I haven't actually decided anything yet," I said. "Of course not. I didn't mean to imply that you had. I just wanted you to know that Daniel and I are here to help with whatever you need. The transition, the paperwork, finding the right place. We want to make it as easy as possible for you." As easy as possible for them, she meant. They wanted to streamline the process of removing me from my home and gaining access to my assets. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "I'll certainly keep that in mind." "And Margaret," Jessica continued, "I want to apologize if I came across as harsh on Mother's Day. I was having a difficult time with some personal issues, and I may have said things that sounded more critical than I intended." An apology. How interesting. She'd obviously realized that burning bridges completely might not be strategically smart, especially if they needed my cooperation for their housing scheme. "I appreciate that," I said, though her words felt as hollow as everything else about our relationship. "I hope we can move forward with a fresh start," Jessica said. "Family is so important. and I want us to have a good relationship. Family is important." The irony was staggering, coming from someone who'd called me a burden just weeks earlier. But I could hear the calculation behind her words, the recognition that maintaining some semblance of goodwill might be necessary for achieving their goals. "I'd like that too," I lied smoothly. "Families should be there for each other." "Exactly," Jessica said, relief evident in her voice. "I'm so glad we understand each other." We understood each other perfectly, just not in the way she imagined. She thought she was manipulating a lonely old woman who was desperate for family approval. Instead, she was revealing the extent of her own desperation and strategic thinking to someone who was several moves ahead in the game they were playing. After hanging up, I added Jessica's call to the notes I'd been keeping about their behavior. Patricia had been right about documenting everything. The pattern of manipulation was becoming clear enough that anyone reviewing the evidence would understand what they'd been trying to accomplish. The next morning brought a surprise visit from Daniel, who arrived with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery. The gesture would have been touching if I hadn't recognized it as part of their renewed campaign to win my cooperation. "I brought breakfast," he announced, holding up the bag like a peace offering. "Thought we could spend some time together." "How lovely," I said, genuinely appreciating the pastries, even if I was suspicious of the motives behind them. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a child, where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals and conversations, where I'd eaten alone for the past 2 years. The familiarity of the setting made Daniel's manipulation feel even more painful. "Jessica told me she called you last night," he said, watching my face carefully. "She did. It was nice to hear from her." "She feels terrible about Mother's Day," Daniel continued. "She's been under a lot of stress with work and some family issues of her own. Her father's been having health problems, and she's been helping her mom deal with all that." More excuses, more context designed to make Jessica's behavior seem understandable rather than inexcusable. I wondered if any of it was even true, or if they were simply constructing a narrative that would justify their treatment of me. "I'm sorry to hear about her father," I said. "Is it serious?" "They're not sure yet. He's having some tests done." But it's made Jessica realize how important family is, how we need to stick together and support each other. Support each other. Like they'd supported me on Mother's Day when Jessica called me a burden, and Daniel sat silently while she did it. Family is important, I agreed. Though sometimes people have different ideas about what family support looks like. Daniel nodded earnestly. "That's exactly what we want to talk to you about. Jessica and I have been discussing how we can be more helpful, more involved in your life." More involved. After weeks of establishing boundaries and minimizing contact, they now wanted to be more involved. The timing of their renewed interest, coinciding with their housing scheme, was hardly coincidental. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Well, for starters, we'd like to help you explore your living options. Not to pressure you into anything, but just to make sure you have all the information you need to make the best decision." "What kind of information?" "Jessica's done some research on senior communities in the area," Daniel said, pulling out a folder I hadn't noticed him bring in. "She's found several that might be perfect for you." Jessica had done research. How thorough of her, especially considering that just weeks ago she'd made it clear that my needs were too much of a burden for them to manage. Daniel spread brochures across the table, each one featuring smiling seniors engaged in various activities. The photography was professional, the amenities impressive, the prices carefully hidden in small print on the back pages. "This one has a really good reputation," Daniel said, pointing to a brochure for Desert Springs Senior Living. "They have art classes, book clubs, fitness programs. You'd love it there." I picked up the brochure and studied it, noting the emphasis on security, medical support, and structured activities. It looked pleasant enough, but it also looked like a place where independence went to die, where seniors were kept comfortable and occupied until they were no longer anyone's concern. "The initial fee is quite reasonable," Daniel continued, though I doubted he'd calculated it as a percentage of my total assets. "And the monthly costs include everything, so you wouldn't have to worry about unexpected expenses." "How much are we talking about?" I asked, curious to see if he'd be honest about the financial implications. Daniel hesitated, probably calculating how to present the numbers in the most favorable light. The buy-in is $65,000, and the monthly fee is about $4,000. But when you factor in what you're spending now on property taxes, utilities, maintenance, insurance, it's probably pretty comparable. $65,000 upfront, plus $48,000 per year in monthly fees. Nearly $50,000 more than I currently spent on housing, not including the lost appreciation on the house itself. It was a terrible financial decision disguised as a practical one. And what happens to the $65,000 when I die? I asked. Well, it's not refundable, Daniel admitted. But you wouldn't need to worry about property maintenance or unexpected repairs or any of that stress. Not refundable. So I'd pay $65,000 for the privilege of renting an apartment until I died, at which point the money would simply disappear. Meanwhile, my house would be sold and the proceeds would go to Daniel and Jessica, netting them hundreds of thousands of dollars for convincing me to make a financially disastrous decision. It's an interesting option, I said neutrally. I'll need time to think about it. Of course, Daniel said quickly. We don't want you to feel rushed, but maybe we could schedule a visit just to see what you think. They give tours every Tuesday and Thursday. Maybe, I said, though I had no intention of touring a facility I had no interest in living in. We spent the rest of his visit looking through the other brochures, with Daniel pointing out amenities and advantages, while I made non-committal responses. By the time he left, I had a clear picture of their strategy. Convinced me that the senior community was a better option than my current living situation. Helped me sell the house, pocket the proceeds while I paid increasingly expensive fees for diminishing independence. It was a good plan, I had to admit. If I'd been the vulnerable, isolated woman they believed me to be, it might have worked. They were offering to solve problems I didn't have while creating new problems that would benefit them financially. The fact that they were doing it with expressions of love and concern made it even more insidious. That afternoon, I called Sarah Chen at the Phoenix Children's Hospital. Mrs. Brennan, she said warmly, how are you feeling about your donation commitment? Actually, I'd like to discuss increasing it, I said. I'm considering donating some real estate as well. Real estate? That's wonderful news. What kind of property are we talking about? My house. It's worth approximately $400,000, and I'm thinking about donating it to establish an additional endowment. Sarah was quiet for a moment, probably calculating the impact of such a generous gift. Mrs. Brennan, that would be transformative for our research programs. Are you sure you're ready to make that kind of commitment? I'm sure, I said, and for the first time in weeks I felt absolutely certain about something. How would the process work? We'd need to have the property professionally appraised, work with our legal team to handle the transfer, coordinate with your tax advisor about the implications. It's not something that happens overnight, but it's definitely doable. How long would the process typically take? Probably 2 to 3 months, assuming there are no complications with the title or appraisal. 2 to 3 months. That would give me time to complete the transfer before Daniel and Jessica could interfere, assuming they even realized what was happening. Once the house was legally donated to the hospital, there would be nothing left for them to inherit or manipulate me into selling. Let's move forward with it, I said. I'd like to start the process as soon as possible. After scheduling a meeting with the hospital's development team for the following week, I sat in my kitchen and looked around at the home Robert and I had built together. 40 years of memories lived in these walls, 4 decades of love and laughter and the ordinary moments that make up a life. Giving it away felt like both a loss and a liberation. I was losing the place where Daniel had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated his graduations and achievements, where I'd imagined someday hosting his children for holidays and family gatherings. But I was also freeing myself from the weapon it had become in my son's hands, the asset he was using to justify controlling my life. More than that, I was ensuring that my home would continue to serve families, just not in the way I'd originally planned. The money from its sale would fund research that might save children's lives, give hope to parents facing every parent's worst nightmare, create possibilities that wouldn't exist without my contribution. It felt like a better legacy than leaving it to people who saw my death as a financial opportunity rather than a personal loss. The confrontation came exactly 3 weeks later, on a sweltering Thursday afternoon in July. I was in my garden watering the tomatoes when Daniel's BMW pulled into the driveway with unusual speed. Through the car windows, I could see both Daniel and Jessica, their faces set with the kind of determination that meant trouble. I'd been expecting this moment ever since the hospital's appraiser had spent 2 hours measuring and photographing my house the previous week. Neighbors talk, and Mrs. Patterson had undoubtedly mentioned the official-looking man with the clipboard to anyone who would listen. It was only a matter of time before word reached Daniel. They walked across my lawn with purpose, Jessica clutching a manila folder against her chest like a shield. Daniel's jaw was tight, with barely controlled anger, while Jessica looked like she was preparing for war. "Mom," Daniel said without preamble, "we need to talk." "Of course," I said, turning off the hose and wiping my hands on my gardening apron. "Would you like to sit on the patio? I could make some iced tea." "This isn't a social visit," Jessica snapped, abandoning any pretense of politeness. "We know what you're doing." I looked at them calmly, feeling oddly peaceful despite the storm I could see brewing in their eyes. After weeks of manipulation and condescension, we were finally going to have an honest conversation. "What am I doing?" I asked. Daniel pulled out his phone and showed me a screenshot of something. "Mrs. Patterson posted this on the neighborhood Facebook page," he said. "So proud of our neighbor Margaret Brennan for donating her beautiful home to Phoenix Children's Hospital. What an inspiration. Mrs. Patterson." I should have known that my well-meaning neighbor wouldn't be able to keep such exciting news to herself. The irony was that her innocent pride in my generosity had exposed the very thing I'd been trying to keep private until the paperwork was finalized. "The post has 37 comments," Jessica added venomously. "Everyone's talking about how generous and wonderful you are. Except they don't know the truth, do they?" "What truth is that?" I asked. "That you're doing this to spite us," Daniel said, his voice rising. "You're giving away our inheritance because you're angry about some imaginary slight." Imaginary slight. Calling me a burden was apparently imaginary in their revised version of history. "This has nothing to do with spite," I said truthfully. "This is about using my resources to help people who need them." "We need them," Jessica shouted, dropping her composed facade entirely. "Do you have any idea what it costs to live these days? The mortgage, the car payments, the credit cards? We're drowning financially, and you're giving away money that could save us." There it was. The honest desperation behind all their manipulation, the real reason they'd been pushing so hard for me to sell the house and move to a senior community. They weren't worried about my safety or well-being. They were worried about their debt. "If you're having financial difficulties," I said gently, "perhaps you should consider downsizing, reducing your expenses, living within your means." "Living within our means?" Jessica's voice cracked with hysteria. "We have a lifestyle to maintain. Daniel has a professional reputation to uphold. We can't just move to some cheap apartment and drive used cars." "Why not?" I asked. "Your father and I drove used cars for the first 15 years of our marriage. We lived in a tiny apartment and saved every penny so we could eventually buy this house. There's no shame in living modestly while you build your financial foundation." "That was different," Daniel said. "The economy was different then. Everything was cheaper." "Everything was cheaper because people expected less," I replied. "You've confused wants with needs, and now you're angry that I won't subsidize the difference." Jessica opened her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "We've been doing research," she said. "People who make sudden, dramatic changes to their estate plans are often suffering from cognitive decline or depression following a major loss." Quote, "Cognitive decline. They were actually going to try to have me declared incompetent, just as Patricia had warned they might." "We think you need help," Daniel added, his voice taking on a patronizing tone I'd never heard before. "Professional help, to process Dad's death and understand how your grief is affecting your judgment." "My judgment is fine," I said calmly. "In fact, it's better than it's been in years." "Giving away $1 million isn't the action of someone thinking clearly," Jessica insisted. "It's the action of someone who's lost touch with reality." $1 million! She'd done the math, calculated exactly what they were losing, probably down to the penny. The number had undoubtedly been haunting their conversations for weeks. "I'm giving it to organizations that will use it to save children's lives and provide educational opportunities," I said. "How is that evidence of poor judgment?" "Because you're destroying your own security," Daniel exploded. What happens when you need medical care? What happens when you can't live independently anymore? You'll have nothing left. I'll have the same social safety net that millions of other seniors rely on, I said. The same resources that were available to people before adult children felt entitled to inherit their parents' wealth. This is insane, Jessica muttered, pacing across my patio. We're trying to help you, and you're treating us like enemies. You called me a burden, I said quietly. On Mother's Day, you told me that my needs were too much for you to handle, that I was preventing you from building your own life. Now you're angry that I've taken steps to ensure you won't have to carry that burden anymore. That's not what I meant, Jessica said weakly. That's exactly what you meant. And Daniel sat there silently while you said it, which tells me he agreed with you. Daniel flushed red. I was trying to keep the peace. I didn't want a family fight. But you were willing to let your wife destroy our relationship to avoid temporary discomfort, I said. That's a choice, Daniel. You chose her feelings over mine, her comfort over our family bond. She's my wife, he protested. And I'm your mother. I raised you, sacrificed for you, loved you unconditionally for 32 years. But none of that mattered when it became inconvenient. Jessica pulled another paper from her folder. We've consulted with an elder law attorney, she said. There are legal options for family members who are concerned about a relative's mental competency. You're threatening to have me declared incompetent? I asked. We're exploring our options to protect you from making decisions you'll regret, Daniel said. Decisions that will cost you money, you mean? This isn't about money, Daniel shouted, though everything about their behavior suggested otherwise. It's entirely about money, I said. If I'd given away $1,000, you wouldn't care. If I'd donated an old car, you'd probably call it generous. But because it's enough money to solve your financial problems, suddenly it's evidence of mental illness. $1 million is different, Jessica said. It's not the kind of money you give away on impulse. I didn't give it away on impulse. I spent weeks researching organizations, meeting with professionals, consulting with attorneys and financial advisors. Every decision was carefully considered and properly documented. Documented by people who had a financial interest in your donations, Jessica countered. Of course they told you it was a good idea. They were getting rich off your confusion. The accusation was so absurd I almost laughed. The Children's Hospital is getting rich off my donation? The Humane Society is taking advantage of me? The scholarship fund is exploiting my grief? You're being manipulated, Daniel insisted. These organizations have professional fundraisers whose job is to convince wealthy people to give away their money. Unlike you and Jessica, who would never try to manipulate me for financial gain. The silence that followed was deafening. Neither of them could respond to that accusation because we all knew it was true. We love you, Daniel said finally, his voice breaking. We just want what's best for you. If you loved me, I said, you would have defended me when Jessica called me a burden. If you wanted what was best for me, you would have maintained our relationship instead of trying to minimize it. If you cared about my well-being, you wouldn't be threatening legal action because I'm not dying fast enough to suit your financial needs. That's not fair, Jessica said. None of this is fair, I replied. It's not fair that I spent 47 years building a life with a man I loved, only to lose him and discover that my only child sees me as an inconvenience. It's not fair that I'm supposed to pretend your cruelty was acceptable because you're stressed about money. And it's not fair that I have to prove my sanity to protect my right to give away my own possessions. So this is revenge, Daniel said bitterly. This is justice, I corrected. You wanted freedom from the burden of maintaining a relationship with me. I'm giving you that freedom, along with freedom from any financial benefit that relationship might have provided. Jessica started crying, though whether from frustration or calculation, I couldn't tell. Please don't do this, she said. Please don't destroy our family over a misunderstanding. I'm not destroying our family, I said. I'm acknowledging what you already destroyed. We can fix this, Daniel said desperately. We can work through our problems, go to counseling, find a way to move forward. Some things can't be fixed, I said. Some words can't be unsaid, some betrayals can't be forgiven. So that's it? Daniel asked. 32 years of being your son, and you're just walking away? You walked away first, I said. You just expected me to finance your independence while pretending we still had a relationship. They stayed for another hour, alternating between threats and pleading, but I'd made my peace with the situation weeks ago. The legal papers were signed, the transfers were in progress, and my attorneys had assured me that everything was properly documented and protected. By the time they left, Jessica was openly sobbing, and Daniel looked like he'd aged a decade. I felt sorry for them in a distant way, the way you might feel sorry for strangers facing hardship, but I didn't feel guilty. They had created this situation through their own choices, their own values, their own treatment of someone who had loved them unconditionally. The next morning, I received a call from Patricia. I thought you should know, she said, that we received a formal inquiry from the law firm of Hartwell & Associates yesterday. They're representing your son and daughter-in-law in a potential competency challenge. How do we respond? We already have. I sent them copies of your recent cognitive assessment, documentation of your charitable giving consultations, and a formal letter explaining that you've been working with legal counsel throughout this process. I also mentioned that any frivolous legal challenges would be met with countersuits for harassment and elder abuse. Elder abuse? Attempting to have a competent adult declared incompetent for financial gain absolutely qualifies as elder abuse under Arizona law, Patricia said firmly. Their attorney will advise them to drop this immediately. She was right. I never heard from Hartwell & Associates again. The house donation was finalized on a beautiful morning in August. I signed the final papers in the hospital's conference room, surrounded by grateful staff and representatives from the research department. Dr. Foster presented me with a plaque that would hang in the new research facility, crediting the Margaret and Robert Brennan Endowment for making the work possible. Your generosity will save lives, she said simply. Children who haven't even been born yet will benefit from the research your gift makes possible. That afternoon, I moved into a comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in a complex near the university. It was bright and modern, with a small balcony that overlooked a garden area where I could continue growing tomatoes in containers. The rent was reasonable, the neighbors were friendly, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt like I was living rather than just existing. Elena Rodriguez helped me pack my kitchen items, insisting that she owed me far more than the assistance she could provide. You changed my life, she said as we wrapped my good china in newspaper. I got my GED last week, and next month I start classes at the community college. You changed your own life, I corrected. I just provided a little support. That support made all the difference, she said. Sophia and we will never forget what you did for us. Her gratitude was genuine, uncomplicated by resentment or entitlement. She understood that generosity was a gift, not an obligation, and she received it with the grace that made giving worthwhile. I never heard from Daniel or Jessica again, though I occasionally saw updates about their lives through mutual acquaintances. They'd sold their house and moved to a smaller place across town. Daniel had taken a second job to help with their debt payments. Jessica had started working full-time for the first time since their marriage. They were learning to live within their means, just as Robert and I had done 40 years earlier. The lesson was painful but necessary, and ultimately it would make them stronger people if they allowed it to. On the first anniversary of Robert's death, I visited his grave with flowers from my container garden. The headstone was simple but elegant, marking the resting place of a man who had been a devoted teacher, loving husband, and caring father. I think you'd be proud of what I've done, I told him. The research endowment is already funding important work, and the scholarship recipients are amazing kids who really deserve the opportunity. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and for a moment I could almost feel his presence, his approval of the choices I'd made. I miss you, I said, but I'm not lost without you anymore. I remember who I am. Driving home from the cemetery, I passed the neighborhood where I'd lived for 40 years. My former house looked different already, with new landscaping and a fresh coat of paint. The hospital had sold it to a young family with 3 children, and through the windows I could see toys scattered in the living room and artwork taped to the refrigerator. It was exactly what Robert and I had envisioned when we first bought the house. A place where children would grow up loved and safe and encouraged to dream big dreams. The fact that those children weren't my grandchildren no longer mattered as much as I'd thought it would. That evening, I had dinner with Elena and Sophia, who had become like family to me in the year since we'd met. Sophia, now in 4th grade, showed me her latest math homework and told me about her plans to become a veterinarian when she grew up. "Mrs. Margaret," she said seriously, "my mama says you gave away your whole house to help sick kids. Is that true?" "It's true," I said. "That was really nice of you," Sophia said. "I hope if I get sick, someone like you will help me too." "I hope you never get sick," I said. "But if you do, there will be doctors and researchers working to help you, and some of them will be there because people like me believed their work was important." After Elena and Sophia went home, I sat on my small balcony with a cup of tea and reflected on the year that had passed since that devastating Mother's Day. I'd lost a son and gained a deeper understanding of my own strength. I'd given away a fortune and felt richer than I'd ever been. I'd been called a burden and discovered that I was actually a blessing to people who knew how to recognize one. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. For a moment, I wondered if it might be Daniel, finally ready to apologize and rebuild our relationship. But the caller ID showed Elena's number. "Mrs. Margaret," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice, "I got accepted to the nursing program. Full scholarship, everything paid for. I start in January." "Elena, that's wonderful news! I'm so proud of you." "I couldn't have done this without you believing in me," she said. "You saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." After we hung up, I realized that this was what family really meant. People who believed in each other, supported each other's dreams, and celebrated each other's successes without calculating what they might gain from the relationship. I'd spent 32 years trying to be the perfect mother to a son who ultimately saw me as nothing more than a financial resource. But in the past year, I discovered that I could be a perfect mentor, friend, and surrogate grandmother to people who valued those relationships for their own sake. Blood might be thicker than water, but gratitude was stronger than both. 6 months later, I received a letter from the Phoenix Children's Hospital with updates on the research being funded by my endowment. They'd hired Dr. Patricia Williams, a brilliant young researcher who was developing innovative treatments for pediatric brain tumors. Her preliminary results were promising enough to attract additional funding from the National Institutes of Health. The letter included a photo of Dr. Williams in her laboratory, surrounded by equipment that my donation had helped purchase. In the corner of the image, almost too small to notice, was a small plaque that read, "The Margaret and Robert Brennan Pediatric Cancer Research Laboratory." I framed the photo and hung it in my living room, where it joined pictures of Elena at her nursing school graduation and Sophia at her 5th grade science fair. These were my family now, people whose lives I'd touched and who had touched mine in return, relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or expectation. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if Daniel and Jessica had approached that Mother's Day differently, if they'd chosen love over convenience and respect over control. But those were thoughts for rainy days and quiet moments. Most of the time, I was too busy living my new life to mourn the old one. I was 69 years old, financially secure despite giving away most of my wealth, and surrounded by people who valued my presence in their lives. I volunteered at the Literacy Center 3 days a week, took watercolor classes on Thursdays, and spent weekends exploring Arizona with a group of friends I'd met at the community college's lifelong learning program. I had dinner plans and travel companions and people who called just to check on me. I had purpose and passion and the freedom to make choices based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. Most importantly, I had peace. The desperate longing for family connection that had made me vulnerable to manipulation was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of relationships that were chosen rather than inherited, nurtured rather than demanded. Daniel and Jessica had wanted me to disappear quietly from their lives, to minimize my impact while maximizing their inheritance. Instead, I disappeared loudly and completely, taking with me everything they'd assumed would eventually be theirs. They'd called me a burden, never imagining that burden was worth nearly $1 million to people who would actually appreciate it. They'd dismissed me as irrelevant, never considering that my relevance was something they would lose along with my money. In trying to diminish me, they'd freed me to become more than I'd ever been before. It was the best Mother's Day gift they could have given me, though they'd never understand why. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.